worked with at the University of Wisconsin that had developed some technology in their laboratory and successfully licensed that out and started a small company, and grew that company really largely with a bunch of research grants, SBIR grants, advanced technology program grants, and some of the technology that they had developed was DNA transfection type reagents and DNA labeling reagents. So we actually had a product line as well. So they ended up only having to give up a very small portion of their company in terms of to early investors. They never had to go to the the venture capital type route. So these guys are all multi-millionaires now and living well. That was a fun time in my life. I actually started my career as a genetics counselor. So I have kind of come full circle from being kind of on the clinical side of things, and then transitioning into research administration. So I've given this talk a number of different times to a number of different groups. And so I just kind of, I'll preface it a little bit. It's a lot of information. Some of it is not going to be relevant to your specific situation, perhaps. So some of it is probably going to be boring for you. But it's more like just FYI, here's some things that I've learned along the way about things to watch out for, grants management, a little bit of kind of education in different areas. One of the things that most of the folks in your situation don't have the opportunities to get any kind of training in this kind of stuff. There's rarely courses that people are taking that teach people, about grants management. So I've got some slides I'll share here, and then I'm hoping to preserve enough time to kind of just go through an example of how I create a grant budget for like a small kind of make-believe grant. And some thoughts about budget justification and kind of how to reconcile your spending along your grant after it's kind of awarded. So I'll try to manage my time, appropriately. It always seems like I do kind of run short towards the end. So we'll see how I do. Please just interrupt if you have any questions or something's not clear, or you even have a question and just trigger whatever I've been talking about, kind of just triggered a thought in your head, and we'll see if I can have the answer for you. So let me go ahead and share my slides here. And we'll get started. So get this in presentation mode here. All right, are you guys seeing that in presentation mode?
Yep, it looks great.
Okay. Get your faces up over here. This other screen. Okay. Couple of obvious points is that when you decide to become the PI on a grant, buck stops with you. Even if you've got very capable lab manager and lab staff and other folks kind of assisting you, ultimately you have to answer to any questions that that come your way on how you spent your money. And in the next slide, I'll make a couple of points that I find surprising for PI. So really, you're responsible for the financial management. You're responsible for ensuring that you're spending the money the way that your funding institution is intending you to spend it, the way that you told them you would spend it, and that you spend it in within the confines of the applicable policies and regulations. And this last point is important. Yeah, you're responsible for keeping appropriate records and documentation. And the thing to remember is that it'll be hardly often that somebody is coming and asking you about documentation for a specific expense actually during your grant. These things tend to happen years after a grant is over, an institution is going through some kind of an audit, and then somebody starts poking around in your grant and asking questions, and you're trying to remember what the hell you did 3 years ago with that grant. So, kind of having a folder, whether it's electronic or paper, where you kind of keep some of your documentation, some of your thoughts, some notes that you may have written to just help justify certain actions that you took during the course of your grant is helpful to refer back to. I'm not intending you to read this entire thing. This is directly the definition of the responsibilities of the principal investigator from the NIH grants policy document. It's very wordy, but the thing when I first read it that struck me was that here you all are budding young scientists, maybe even some of you established scientists, and of course that's what's driving your career right now, and you're most proud of your scientific accomplishments. But when you start reading what they're expecting you to do, it's all administrative, except for the last sentence there that I've highlighted, which is almost, to me, sounds like an afterthought, which is, oh, by the way, we encourage you to keep in contact with your program officer to discuss your science. And so that's really kind of the last thing that they say here, when really what they're kind of spelling out is that you're responsible for ensuring compliance. You're responsible for creating and maintaining appropriate documentation. And those are the things that are important to them. So clearly, in the end game, they're interested in advancing your science. But in reality, they want to make sure that you're being a good steward of the money that's either coming from their foundation or from those of us that are taxpayers, for folks like the NIH dollars and whatnot. So I just wanted to give you some comments about a notice of grant award. So this is an NIH notice of grant award. So for those of you that may not have received an NIH grant, this is what it looks like. This is actually one page that I've kind of split into and blown up. So this is the cover page. It's called the notice of award. And it'll remind you what institute at NIH is funding you. It will specifically give you your grant number and just some added information. These little numbers that are on the end of your grant number are what year of your grant segment you're in. So for this is the most current CCTSI UL1 grant award. That's the largest grant for the CCTSI. Happens to be the largest single grant at the Anschutz campus as well. And we're in the 5th year of our current 5-year cycle. The first 3 letters are, what mechanism you're being awarded under. And so, your RO1, K12, K23, T32, that's what this says what kind of NIH funding mechanism is. This is the 2-letter designation of the institute that's funding you. So heart, lung, and blood is HL. Cancer Center is CA, I believe. We're translational sciences, and so there's this TR. On the farther down on the first page, lists you as the PI. It gives you important contact information. So your program officer, and then your grants management specialist. So if you're communicating with NIH, these are the folks you're going to be communicating with. And it gives you a high-level summary breakdown of your current year budget. It tells you what year you're in, the current budget period. So our particular grant started in May of this year and it ends April 30th of 2023. And then the second date range is the entire project range. And so oftentimes you'll be referring back to that if you're completing documents like your NIH other support or something like that, where you need to have this information. The next page is a detailed breakdown of your budget that's being awarded. And so it breaks it down into kind of your personnel costs, your other big, large budget item categories. We've got 6 or 7 large subcontracts that we have associated with our award. And then, what your direct costs, your F&A. In earlier versions of this award, this table here would be bigger. So in year 1, you would have your breakdown here, and this table would have your 2, 3, 4, and 5, and it would tell you what they're expecting to fund your future years of your grant at. The next slides here are kind of just to drive home the point that you're excited to get your grant award. You want to see how much money you got. You're disappointed when you see that your budget has been cut in some fashion. You're trying to figure that out. Don't stop reading at this page, because there's important information that you as the PI are going to be held accountable for, that is farther down. And this is just kind of just some snapshots here. So there's the next section is this standard terms and conditions. This is where it's going to tell you what is some of your required reporting. And so we're in the 5th year of our grant cycle. So it's telling us that, we've got to do a final FFR has to be prepared and submitted. Grants and Contracts does the financial report, but there's an invention statement disclosure that has to be completed, and that's your responsibility. You and your administrative support, whoever is in your department, division, section, whatever, to help with this. This is something that Grants and Contracts doesn't do, but you're responsible for having to put that together. There are annual progress reports, and that's what the RPPR is, the Research Performance Progress Report. And so every year when you go from year 1 to year 2, you have to prepare an RPPR. It's due 60 days before that next year of funding. When you're in your last year, you have a final or a closeout kind of a RPPR that's actually due 120 days after the end of your grant period. So you find out this stuff by reading through some of these sections that have terms and conditions, and you should do that and highlight areas where you think you're being asked to prepare some kind of a report or provide some type of information, understand the time frame. And if you don't really understand what they're asking, then make sure that you reach out to folks locally at our Grants and Contracts here to say, hey, help me interpret what this really means. Or if you've got administrative support within your division, department, section, whatever, somebody there that can help you understand that, so that you get these things notated and you don't let them pass you by and you become delinquent, because not complying with some of this, if you're in the middle of a competitive, like a segment, like a 5-year grant, your year 2 or 3, if you fail to do something, it could hold up actually the start of your next grant period. So then there's another section that's the specific award conditions, and this is where it gets down into some of the nitty gritty about specifically what they're telling you about this grant that's being funded. It's less more general and standard, but more like, hey, this is specific to your grant. So here's some that are in this particular notice of award that we're reviewing right now. These are actual things that I cut out of there. So many of you know that the CCTSI has a pretty robust pilot grant program. We give out a lot of pilot grants. So we've got a chunk of money in our grant for issuing pilot awards. But NIH still has to do the standard level of human subjects and animal subject review that they would do if you were submitting an individual R01 or an individual K award that had, say, animal studies or a specific, human clinical research trial embedded in it. You would have to be providing them with a copy of your IRB and lots of the human subjects related documents so that they could review. We have to do that, but we do it after the fact because we've already got the money in our grant, and now we're making these awards. But NIH is saying, "Hey, wait, those people can't spend that money until we've validated that what they're going to be proposing for human research and animal research, meets the regulations, and that we agree that it's something that we want you on." So this is just saying, delayed onset review of human subjects is required before those dollars can be spent. It's the same thing on the animal side. So these are in different sections of this specific award conditions section. This is where it'll list your key personnel. So I've got a couple of slides that talks about key personnel down the road here. These are the key personnel on our CTSA grant. And there's important requirements for a key personnel. The PI is always a key personnel. So, that's why it starts out in the addition to the PI, these other people are also key personnel. You're not allowed to change the level of funding for a key person on your grant by more than 25% of what you said you would fund them at. So if you're supporting them at 50%, they can only go down to, I think it's like 38% or something like that of supported FTE before you actually have to write and communicate with your program officer, your grants management specialist, to get approval to reduce that funding or even increase that funding by more than that 20% bracket. Also, if for some reason a key person on your grant had to leave the project for a certain period of time, maybe illness, maybe some other family complication or professional complication or whatever, if it's going to be longer than 3 months, you have to actually communicate that with your program officer and grants management specialist and make sure that you have approval and that they're aware of the situation that's going on. And so the folks that, you only have to do that for the folks that are specifically listed in this section as key personnel. Otherwise, anybody else on your grant, in your grant budget, you can change them, you can add them, you can delete them, you can increase them, you can decrease the funded effort on the project. As long as they're not listed here, you've got to be a broad leeway there, as long as they're allowable positions on your grant. Like I made a comment down in some later slides here that for most all of the types of grants that you guys would be involved in, you couldn't support like an admin assistant. It's just not allowable type of support for a grant. And this is interesting. We had a supplement to our UL1 grant that was this amount of dollars for 3 years. And so after the first year, they rolled those dollars into this grant. So it was no longer a separate supplement. They just added those dollars to our main grant. But now this is in there, and it says, these supplement dollars are now in this budget essentially, and it can only be spent for that purpose. So if I don't remember to, exactly spend this amount of dollars out of that 8 million something for this particular purpose, then if we got audited, it'd be non-compliant. We'd have to return that money. So here's some comments about key persons. So there's two definitions. There's the regular NIH definition that I think you guys are probably all, kind of aware of. It's a key personnel is usually somebody with an advanced degree that's going to, contribute substantially to the scientific development or execution of the project, and we call those folks, key personnel. And then there's our local university kind of definition, which is it's pretty much anybody that's involved in the conduct of your project and gathering data, analyzing data, and the important distinction here is that these folks are required to complete their financial conflict of interest disclosure for the university. Grants and contracts won't actually route your grant. If the folks that are identified in the budget as kind of key contributors have not completed their financial conflict of interest disclosure. So that's important to note. A couple of comments, and you guys may have covered this in some of your other trainings, but there's a new biosketch and other support requirement that the NIH rolled out late in 2021. They initially said, for submissions after May, they ended up delaying that, and ultimately it was submissions after January. But certainly early in 2022, these became required. So there's a new biosketch format. You can just go onto the NIH page and search for biosketch page. So they've renamed the one section, but the most important piece is basically right here. There's a personal statement that's always been part of it, but now there's not a separate section in the biosketch for your funded or completed grant work. You can take selected grants that are currently active or have been completed, and you can put them into your personal statement and draw attention to that work if you'd like. And the personal statement is supposed to be specific to each application that you're using this biosketch for. So they really want you to basically modify that personal statement for each of your different grant applications. And if you're on somebody else's grant and have to provide your biosketch, they want that modified for we just submitted our recomposition for the CTSA, large CTSA grant that would start May of 2023. And we had something like 80 biosketches or something in there. And Dr. Sokol, really wanted them all to say, start with something like my contributions to this project or my effort on this project is related to, A, B, and C. And then this is what my role will be. And then you go into kind of your standard highlights of your personal statement. The other thing I want to draw your attention to is your other support page. Oftentimes when you're getting ready to get a grant funded, NIH will reach out to you and ask for specific information. That process is called just-in-time information, JIT. And often they'll ask for other supportive key personnel. and they really want to be able to identify and confirm that people are not overcommitted, so that people that are listed as key personnel in your grant have funded effort in your budget, that they can accommodate that 5% or 10%, and that they're not over 100%. So that's the purpose of the other support. But there's this new requirement that you have to have a signature block. And so I ran into a problem with this actually this last spring, trying to respond to the just in time for this 5th year budget that was just getting awarded. So I've got a couple of paste outs here. Used to be that we could just use this, right? Just Dr. Sokol's just kind of copied electronic signature. This is a required statement now that's part of this new the support format, and you have to sign it. So we signed it like this and sent them in as part of our JIT, and they did not accept that. They would not accept this type of a signature. It has to be something like that, where it's clear that it has gone through one of the Adobe or DocuSign type of processes. Here's another one that was acceptable, Dr. Courts. She didn't provide the kind of that type of signature. It was just this, and that's fine. But anytime that we provided one of these other support forms that did not have some kind of electronic stamp, we had to resubmit that. So just some points to consider. So there's some comments on typical required reporting that you might have to do as a PI. Certainly, you're required to do your annual financial conflict of interest disclosure. That takes about 15 minutes or so to go through. You usually get a prompt from grants and contracts that it's time to go in and do that. If you have effort supported on a sponsored project, you get an EPR report. It's important that you complete those and submit those. Those are legal documents that you're verifying to the federal government. If they come in an audit and they ask for it, you're verifying that yes, I was supported by this project and I provided that effort. So when you look at your EPR statement, if you don't understand it or something doesn't look right, then you need to go and talk to the folks in the administrative unit of your department, section, division, whatever, to get clarification, just to be sure that you understand why your salary has been supported on project B or whatever. If you don't understand it, you need to ask questions because it's a legal document, and oftentimes auditors will request those EPR statements. And if you've made a statement that, yeah, I worked on that project, and then they come in and ask questions about that project and you don't know a damn thing about it, then there's problems that will ensue on that. So those EPRs are more than just kind of just going through the motions of saying, yeah, 10, 15. I always recommend that if you're going through those percentages in the top half of that form, which is the sponsored projects that you're funded on, if you don't agree with the numbers that are given there, so it might say 10%, and you're like, oh God, I thought I was 15% on that project, or it might say 70%, and you're like, oh geez, I thought I was 50%. Don't just go in and change it when the subsequent box where you're supposed to put in the effort. Don't just go in and put in the effort what you think it is, because that also causes problems for administrators like me on the back end, because the system wants to go in and then kind of shuffle around that effort and move that effort to the different projects based upon what you've put on, and that's just problematic as well. The best approach is, if you don't agree, go ask questions. It's okay that those things vary by 3, 4, 5%. That's fine. I wouldn't worry about it if it was at 30% and you're like, well, gosh, I thought it was at 35% kind of a thing. That's not that big of a deal. Big swings, or certainly projects that list you as being associated with them with funded effort, if you don't understand it, ask questions. This public access, NIH public access reporting, you're required to cite your grant on manuscripts that incorporate data that were generated as part of that, funding that you received. And so it's definitely a requirement that you have to do. It's a big hassle for me because we've got hundreds of people that use CCTSI resources. They have clinical research projects that are in the CTRCs. They get pilot grants, whatever, you name it. And then they cite our grant on it. And we're not the authors on that grant. But our grant is now attached to that. And so if that particular publication is not compliant, they've cited our grant, but they haven't completed the compliance steps associated, then it holds up our award. So this last year, we had a group of investigators that were all at Stanford for some reason, and I didn't know any of them, but one of their papers cited our grant, and they never completed the necessary steps to complete the compliance process. And so NIH would not issue this 5th year that we're talking about right now. It took us about 3 or 4 weeks to get that squared away. And this one author, who was the corresponding author on the manuscript, was getting kind of belligerent with us about, why are we hassling her about this kind of a thing? And it really is, look, your manuscript, your single manuscript is holding up an $8 million grant to the university. We got to get this kind of moving along. So when you cite a grant in the acknowledgement sections or whatever on your manuscript, or whenever you're completing the submission form and you cite it, they will automatically start it down the process of the I guess the approval process or the compliance process. It automatically goes into a system called the NIH manuscript system, NHMS. And they do some review in that system, but then there's also a step where the corresponding author that's associated with that manuscript has to go in to that NIH manuscript system, and they have to confirm certain things. It's literally a process that takes 2 or 3 minutes at the most. But if you don't do it, it just hangs at that step, and it will never get to the compliance stage. So how could this affect you personally? Well, if it's one of your own manuscripts that you've cited and you never actually went into the manuscript system to complete the compliance process, when you go to do your RPPR, the RPPR system is automatically linked to the NHLBI or whatever the MyNCBI, that's what it is, but the MyNCBI kind of PubMed manuscript system. And it will automatically pull in any manuscripts that use your grant number into your RPPR. And if they're non-compliant, it gets flagged as non-compliant. And so you can still submit your RPPR, but it goes to NIH in non-compliant status, and they'll follow up with that publication, and they will not issue your next year of your own funding because you didn't complete the compliance for your own publication. So just a warning to the wise. I'm sure you all are familiar with clinicaltrials.gov. If you've got a clinical research trial that meets certain particular attributes, the IRB will tell you it's an applicable trial. And any type of clinical research projects are supposed to be registered with clinicaltrials.gov, but you do not have to complete certain sections or provide certain information unless it's deemed an applicable trial. And like I said, the IRB makes that designation. And those applicable trials also are linked to the RPPR system. So if your clinicaltrials.gov record is associated with your grant, it will automatically pull into the RPPR system. And it will automatically check that you've provided, if it's been deemed an applicable trial, that you have provided the annual updates and the necessary information. So that's another step that you got to be aware of. That these systems are starting to link each other. It used to be that you had all these rules that you had to do these things, but nobody was checking them. Now they're checking them, and they're actually holding up. The one lever the government has is we're not going to give you your next year's funding until you do all of these things that you're supposed to do. And we've talked enough about this RPPR. That'll be taught that, the prescription for you to do the RPPR will be described in the special terms of the award letter, the timing in there, and the way that you actually activate that is in your ERA Commons account. When you get to the level where your grant is listed, there's a little hyperlink in there that says RPPR. You can click on that, and it'll take you to the RPPR system where you can activate it. And there's people, administrative folks in your divisions that can help you, do that stuff. Required trainings. If any of you are in a training program, you're well aware of this responsible conduct of research course. It's a 10 or 12 series course that's required for all trainees. You all know about your city course training. This last time around, it's probably 2 or 3 years ago now, we were asked as part of the JIT process for our CCTSI grant to submit the GCP training certificates for our key personnel. It's the first time that I've been asked that. Usually it's the training in human subject research documentation that we have to provide, but this was a new twist. And I honestly don't know what triggers when somebody is required to do GCP, but just be aware that that training is out there. It's, it's like one of the HIPAA module kinds of things. And we were actually asked to provide those training certificates for our key personnel. And then if you're doing animal work, you've got the IACUC. If you have a subcontract on your grant, you are still the PI and you are still responsible for everything that happens at that other institution. So Amy Gannon asked that I kind of put in a couple of points when I'm having these conversations with folks. You're working with, obviously one of your collaborators or something like that, because if you're willing to, enter into a subcontract relationship with them, they're providing some important aspect of contribution to your scientific project. So you should be having, reasonably regular conversations with that team to understand what they're doing on your project. And you should take notes about that and just keep them so that you can defend questions down the line that, yeah, you were involved in overseeing that science. And you should have some general knowledge about what their budget is, because you should have been involved in helping to develop that at the time that you submitted your application, and certainly at the time that you processed the paperwork to get that subcontract agreement in place. And then typically what they'll do is on a regular basis, usually depends on how good the institution is. We work with some that don't invoice regularly, and we might get one invoice at the end of the year, which is ridiculous. But usually every couple months they'll submit an invoice, and then that'll get charged to your grant. And you should have at some point in the life of your project each year, you should at least be asking the question for your subrecipient expenses, what are they spending their money on, right? So you should have some general knowledge and be able to say, yeah, that makes sense, okay. But if you glance at ultimately at a handful of those invoices and they've got expenses in there for items that you're like, I don't understand why they're buying a $2,000 printer or something like that, you'll be asking the question. I'm not suggesting that you get in the weeds and that you sign off, personally on every invoice, but at some point you should be asking your administrative support staff, hey, show me what these invoices are, what National Jewish is invoicing me for on this project. You're going to be, through your regular conversations, having an understanding that the work is actually being done. One of the big problems that has happened and that the government is paying more attention to these days is you start a subcontract with let's just use a National Jewish, just for the hell of it. So you've got to collaborate at National Jewish. You're going to start a project with them. You get the subcontract issued in a reasonable fashion. It's in place, a month or so after your grant started, and lo and behold, they start charging the effort for their people that are on that budget to that project. And then you're having conversations with your colleague, and they're not doing any work on the project because they haven't gotten their act together yet. Maybe they're waiting on certain approvals within their own institution or whatever, but they're charging effort to your project and they're not doing any work. That's technically illegal. And the federal auditors are paying more attention to this type of situation. And so, if you become aware of a situation like that, you should just be, having that transparent conversation to say, hey, you can't be charging effort to this project until you guys start doing work. Now, once you start doing work, you can charge more effort than you said you were gonna. So like if you were on there for 20% for the year and you now finally you're getting work, you can start 3 months after the project starts. Sure, charge 40% effort, I don't care, but at least charge it consistent with when you're working on the project. Don't tell me that you started charging effort in May and you first did your first experiment and thinking about it in July or August, because that's going to lead problems to you. It's not the right way to do business. And then there's this, they got to make sure that within 60 days at the end of the budget period, they've got to have submitted their invoices to get paid, because ultimately each year that project has to get closed out by grants and contracts so that they can start the next one. So that's in the contract, 60 days. So let's just say a few words about audits here. So an auditor is really looking to see that you followed the rules, right? And what it comes down to is they're looking at, they're going to say, okay, we're going to pick this project and we're going to look at some representative examples of what they spend the money on. And they're looking to see, did you spend the money on unallowable things? And do you have a reasonable amount of documentation to support what you spent the money on? So this here is just an example of a statement that was pulled out of an audit report for another institution, where they said they looked at 163 transactions totaling 8.5 million. 8 transactions totaled $335,000 were either not allowable for these reasons. And the biggest reason that they disallowed certain expenses is that there was not adequate documentation for what it was spent on. A small bit because the costs weren't reasonable. And I've got a slide we'll talk about what that actually means. And this will come up too, costs that weren't treated consistently. So the university's got a particular policy on how, cost X is supposed to be treated. And this particular audit deemed that this small transaction here, it fell outside the scope of how the institution would normally treat this type of transaction. But the take-home message here is that there just wasn't documentation to support these expenses. Now, this is important because this audit usually occurs a year or 2 or 3 or 4 after the end of the project. And if they deem it not allowable, these costs have to get moved off your grant. And then they've already been costs that are incurred, so they have to be put someplace. And so they're either going to go to a pot of money that you have available as reserve funds to support your research program. So you're going to end up having to pay for these, or if you don't have any reserve money, it goes to your chair. So your department chair and department have to pick up for your mistakes down the line. So that's why we keep kind of hammering on some of this documentation stuff. And just a quick point here is that most of the things that you will purchase will be in Marketplace or Concur if they're supporting your research program. So those invoices and that documentation, those are part of those electronic systems already, and it's not a problem. And for most of you, your funded research is probably the standard types of stuff that goes on our campus, right? It's basic laboratory research, it's animal research, it's clinical research stuff. It all falls into kind of pretty general buckets of expected types of expenses. I wouldn't get all up in arms about documenting all of these regular routine types of expenses, but if there's something weird that you need to support your project, and it doesn't make sense to somebody like me that doesn't know your project, or even an auditor that's looking in from the outside and knows less about what's going on, then just attaching a quick little comment, either to the Marketplace record, to the Concur expense. So Concur expense is stuff that you might purchase on a procurement card, shows up in Concur, has to be allocated to your grant. There's a comment box in there, and you can easily put a comment on there, and the documents have to be scanned and uploaded into that system. You can easily write a comment on an invoice that just made it clear as how does this particular expense, why is it necessary, how does it benefit your project? So keep those things in mind. If you've got something that you got to buy and it's not kind of standard, and you're thinking, if somebody looks at this in 2 years, how are they going to know why I needed it for my project? Make a note. Toss it in that file if it's not uploaded electronically. They'll be looking at things like, what did you state in your application you would do? So, if you said that you would be doing a whole bunch of animal expenses and animal experiments, and you didn't do any for some reason, and you've all got a bunch of other expenses in a different area, that might be something that you would want to document, because they're certainly probably going to be asked about it. They look at those EPR. They look at those EPR statements. They're going to look at the notice of award that says, okay, what program funded you? What's expected of the program? What were you expected to do? They'll look at timesheets if applicable, and they certainly look at financial statements. So what can you do to protect yourself? Read your grant award. Understand what types of expenses are usually kind of red flags, because if these are part of your project, then you definitely need to go out of your way to document these. Certainly alcohol. So unless you're doing a clinical research study that's an alcohol study where you having to purchase alcohol for people to consume under controlled circumstances, then you would not expect to see that on your grant. Professional dues are almost always not allowable. You can get them paid for, and you can document this and justify it if sometimes you need to go to a conference, right? And the non-member rate is $500 to register. The member rate is $350, but the annual dues are $150. So in that circumstance, you could justify that it made sense to become a member of this society for a year because it was the same cost as registering as a non-member. And so if that's important, you could do it. And we've done that a lot of times, but you definitely need to document that. You typically can't put admin staff onto a regular research grant. Food is very sensitive. If at all possible, just avoid spending it on food. You definitely can't buy lunch for your lab staff while you're having your monthly lab meeting. That's just absolutely not allowable. Does your research involve work in the community where you're meeting with community members, you're having meetings that are part of your funded activities? Do you want to provide refreshments? Yes, that's allowable. You can typically do it. But yeah, in that circumstance, this is where you got to have your documentation. You need to have an agenda. You need to have a list of who's there. You need a detailed receipt for the food, so it's clear that no alcohol was purchased. And typically, the activity that involves food should be on the agenda, so it's like part of the working part of that meeting. We do a ton of that with the CCTSI, and I'm very clear to make sure that all my staff have all of that documentation. I send those expense reports back to them if they submit them to me with food, and that information isn't on there because I want to make sure I have it. Almost always you can't buy furniture. That's part of the F&A. So you can't just buy yourself an office desk or an office chair. It's typically not allowable. You could buy a special desk in the laboratory for a microscope that's part of the funded project. That's fine. You could buy a specific laboratory chair that's needed to allow for proper height or whatever. You can make up all kinds of rules, but general office furniture is part of the institution's F&A rate that gets paid by the government. First class travel is not allowable. That speaks to itself. Also, if you have questions, you should just know who at grants and contracts you might reach out to, just in the called post-award specialists or the right people within your administrative support for your your department or division. Document your decisions. The retention rules for documents are 3 years past the end of the last year of the segment. So for me, I've got to keep those documents from year one, at least for 3 years past the end of this 5th year grant. And so that's true for, for all of your grants as well. It's 3 years past the end of the grant itself. This is a comment that Allison Lakin hammered into all of us when the feds were on campus 10 years ago, auditing our institution. It's just like, if you end up having to speak to an auditor, treat it like speaking to a lawyer. Just answer the question and stop and make them continue to ask you questions. Don't continue to provide information that just opens the door for them to dig deeper and deeper and deeper. Not that you're trying to hide anything. It's just that we never want to give them the opportunity to scrutinize, all of your records, because ultimately, we all make mistakes. And then this is my particular plea as an administrator. When you're leaving the institution, just make sure that somebody knows where all your documentation is, because it's those of us that are in my positions, we're the ones that get asked first and have to go digging around to try to find any supporting document. This is often years after a project is over. Okay. So just reminding you guys to interrupt me if you have any questions, but let's just plow forward and talk about some basic cost principles and budgets. So some basic principles. So a direct charge to your grant, it has to meet these two standards. It needs to be reasonable. It needs to be allocable. And I've got 2 slides here that will talk about that. Costs to be careful. We just kind of talked about this: food, office supplies, administrative personnel, cell phones. You really shouldn't be charging cell phones to your funded project unless it meets this reasonableness thing. Like a lot of your work is out in the field, right? So then that makes a ton of sense. You're actually conducting a lot of business related to this funded project on your cell phone. It also would speak to this term, allocable, which means that your cell phone bill is $100 a month. I wouldn't charge $100 a month to your grant if you think you can justify your cell phone on the grant. Clearly, not everything you're using that phone for is related to your grant. So you would want to determine what percentage of your monthly phone activity is related to your grant and allocate only that percentage, 20%. And so 20 bucks a month, you charge to your grant. The rest gets paid by some other fund type at the university. Office phone charges are supposed to be part of the institution's F&A rate, so those can't be charged to a grant. Internet can't be charged to a grant. Computers, always a gray area. Certainly, if you need a computer to run an instrument in the laboratory that's part of the funded grant, that's a no-brainer. Do you need a computer to do the work of the grant? You could make an argument that you do, right? But again, it's the same example as the cell phone. If I was going to pay for a computer and charge it to my research grant, I would charge like 20%. Certainly, you're using that computer to record data, to analyze data, to prepare the manuscripts that NIH wants you to do to disseminate your scientific knowledge. But I wouldn't charge the entire computer to the grant, because you're not allowed to charge the activities of writing grants to a grant, and you're going to be using that computer to write for your next grant. Clearly, you're using your computer to use your email and conduct all of the other email activities of our professional lives that are unrelated to your specific research grant. So I think you get the point there. And then you would want to document that. I mean, just with a quick little note. Just laptop is essential to get the work done. I'm estimating that 20% of the use of this computer is related to this grant. That's all you got to do. And then it shows an auditor that you just thought through the concept. We talked about dues. F&A, I've got a slide that talks about F&A. People often say that they don't understand what it is. And so I'm going to try to explain it to you. So here's the reasonable thing. A cost is reasonable if in its nature and amount does not exceed that which is a prudent person under the circumstances would think is reasonable. So my example is, if you don't need the Cadillac, you should be buying the Ford. If you do need the Cadillac, you better provide some documentation around why is it that you had to buy that $4,000 computer when everybody knows that you can get a computer for a couple of $1,000s that's great and does the job. So think like that. Think like, what would a reasonable person that doesn't understand anything about my project think about this expense? And if it smells a little like somebody might think it's unreasonable, just make a document, make a note about it and throw it in your folder. And then if anybody asks about it later, you're like, yeah, this is why. Right here. Allocable is what I just talked about. You get the idea. Here's a different example. So that startup biotech company that I told you that I worked for, often we'd have 8, 9 SBIR grants going at the same time. These are all relatively small, $100,000, $200,000 grants, right? But they all were funding the same basic body of research that we were doing in our small company. And they all had budget lines in them for laboratory supplies and reagents, right? And so when you've got all these projects working in the same laboratory space, how are you kind of determining what gets charged to each grant? And so anytime that we were buying a very specific item for one project. If it was for that project, we would charge it to that project. Otherwise, we still had to buy gloves, we still had to buy pipette tips, we still had to buy, tubes and everything else, and general laboratory reagents. And so I just set up, and it speaks to this point number 3 here, I just rotated. And so if I bought gloves for the lab last month and charged it to project A, this time I would charge it to project B. And all I did was write up a little tiny SOP and just kept it in my files. And every year when we had, our standard grants audit, I would show that to the auditors, and they'd be like, okay, that's fine. You've got some process where you're trying to think through this concept of allocable. How are you going to allocate charges to a grant that makes sense? So that's that concept there. And here's the discussion on F&A. Most investigators have a really negative opinion about F&A. Most administrators like it. You all should have because you're thinking that this is taking away from the amount of money that is funding your research. And many of the RFAs now have changed since when they were years past, where they would say, okay, for this you can submit an application up to $750,000 for this, but that was total cost, right? And so investigators would be like, well, damn, now the university is going to take a third of that for overhead, and so now I can only use 400,000 or whatever to fund my research. Most of the RFAs now kind of are telling you how much in a direct cost capacity you can apply for. So it takes this negative content of F&A as stealing from your research funding out of the context. But the institution absolutely relies on this stream of money to support the research activities on campus, to pay for labs, to pay for all of the research support that's on the campus. So it pays for building maintenance, costs for laboratories and classrooms, utilities, funds the vivarium, funds COMERB, funds a portion of financial operations, procurement operations, grants and contracts. And there's this process where the institution has to renegotiate this every 3 years. That's really, I don't even know why I put that in here. I think largely because usually the financial leadership of the institution will say, hey, we're in our, we're kind of in our renegotiation year. So we've got to make sure that we, are accounting for all of these costs appropriately. And they push on administrators like me to make sure that our operations are complying with what they need. F&A is charged as a percent of every dollar with some exceptions. So there are certain cost categories that are exempt from F&A. And usually it's the ones that are really high dollar, because it's not fair that you've got a couple of high dollar expenses that then have a huge impact on providing the institution with overhead dollars from the government. So equipment over 5,000. These are single time purchases that are high dollar purchases, and so they're exempt from F&A because the institution doesn't really have much cost in that activity. It doesn't take too long to get a quote and prepare a purchase order and receive a piece of equipment. So why should the institution be getting 55% of anything over 5,000? So those are called exempt cost categories. Typically patient care expenses, and I'll speak to this in the budget example that I have. So patient care expenses that are billed directly by the hospitals are exempt from F&A. And subcontract expenses, so the budget that goes to a subrecipient, the university does not charge its own overhead F&A to those costs, except they're allowed to bill the government. It's at the F&A rate on the first $25,000 of expenses to the subrecipient. That allows the institution to recoup the costs involved in the lawyers that are working on the contract, all of the finance that's involved in issuing the contract and paying the invoices and things like that. So that's the one exception, and you need to know that when you're preparing a budget, because you actually have to include the applicable F&A that our institution is allowed to capture on that budget. When you're preparing those budgets in InfoEd, to submit your application, the system will automatically calculate that for you. But it's important for you guys to know that it is a part of that budget calculation. large renovations. And this recently, just within the last, half a dozen years, 3 or 4 even, has come in as a new exempt category with, all of the genomics related work that we're doing. Grants that are supporting research in genomics can have these huge supply budgets for genomics related expenses. And so people started complaining that so much of their budget is going to overhead for these genomics related things. And it's the same concept that I was talking about is, it doesn't take long to put together a $200,000 order for genomics that's related to a lab. And so the university doesn't have a lot of its own overhead involved in that, right? I mean, you get a quote from the vendor, you put the quote through the system, you order it, the supplies, they show up and bill the university $200,000. So that's now an exempt part of a budget. Is any genomics related supplies in a budget over $75,000 are exempt from overhead. The university does get to get their overhead on the first $75,000. And importantly, that should be over the life of the project. So just like the subcontract expenses here, it's cumulative. So if you have a subcontract for 3 years, it's only on the first $25,000 spent on all cumulative expenses for that subcontract that you can charge F&A to those things. But your administrative folks should know all of that and know how to help you. So our campus rate is 55%, has not changed in a long time. I think since 2016, we're supposed to be in the process of renegotiating that. And it should stay around that. It might go up a couple percent, which is what our leadership wants to see, or it may go down a little bit. Off-campus research is capped at 26%. Recently, the university just went for a flat rate for industry-funded clinical trials. It's just 28% across the board. All training training grants are capped at 8%, and many foundations will have their own indirect cost rates, and sometimes they will even say in their RFA that they don't pay overhead, and that's okay. Our institution will accept that as long as you can show them that in the funding announcement from the foundation it says that they won't pay F&A, and you just provide that in your routing documents and they'll approve that. Okay, I got to hurry up a little bit because there's a half hour left, and I do want to show you some of these budget examples that I put together. So here's just some no-brainer stuff. Know who can help you within your departments. Know the administrators that can help you with your grant budgets, your grant submissions, monitoring and reconciling your grant as you're spending money. Some of these ways to procure and buy services, and then we're going to go through a simple budget template and some financial reports. And I believe that's that. So I'm going to stop sharing that. And I am going to, let's see here. I need to share the same screen. And then I thought what I would just show you is kind of, a very simple way for how I would put together a budget preparing for a grant application. So this is a budget template that I created: personnel, equipment, travel, supplies, other costs. There's 3 years. This is a small 3-year grant. It's going to be a clinical research grant. So I've come up with just a very simple kind of study timeline that I'll explain here in a minute. And so now I'm building the costs for my budget so I know what I need to ask the feds to pay for. So always start out with the personnel. So, you're the PI. You're going to have a co-investigator. This data scientist is relatively senior. There's a concept called the NIH salary cap. If you're unfamiliar with that, this is the concept here is that NIH says we will only pay the equivalent of this maximum salary. So even if somebody has, and so this is the current salary, it's published every year by the feds. What's the NIH salary cap? It's now $203,700. So in this particular example, this co-investigator has a salary of $235,000, but we have to calculate the expenses in the budget as if their salary is only 203,000. So that's called an NIH salary cap. And the difference between this number and this number, the burden falls to your department to pay, because this person still gets paid $235,000 a year, even though their effort on this project was capped at this. And so the difference at 5% between these two amounts still has to get paid by the department, because that's this person's salary. So you kind of go through, determine who do you need on your study. And so you've kind of laid that out, brief description of their role, what you think their effort needs to be so that you can get your work done. You're going to ask your administrative folks what their current salaries are. And if I'm preparing this grant application in February, I'm going to inflate these salaries by 3%. And I'm going to put a note in my documentation when I submit it to grants and contracts that I have inflated the current salaries by 3%, because by the time this grant is funded, these people's salaries, because of the July merit, is going to be 3% higher on average, right? So I take that into account. You don't want to immediately start out in the hole by not using information that's accurate. So somebody's going to provide you this. Where is it? I have this OGC link. And every time I do a grant budget, I go here, some fringe benefits, and look at this table here, because these are the fringe benefit rates that you have to put into your budget here. And it's by the type of appointment that somebody has. So there's the Denver campus, we're the Anschutz campus. We've got university staff, greater than 50%, less than 50%, and it tells you what professors, PRAs, full-time faculty up here, greater than 50%, less than. These are the percentages then that you plug in here. And when you route your grant, this is what grants and contracts are primarily looking at. Who is in your budget? What's their job code? What's their current salary? What fringe benefit rates are supposed to be in the budget? And they will correct any mistakes that you make here. So that's just an FYI. And then as you go through each year, depending upon the type of grant that you're applying for, some grants don't allow cost increases each year. But this particular example, I have increased these salaries by 3% each year to try to reflect the fact that it's going to cost me 3% more as a PI to fund these research salaries. So you do that, and then it becomes a simple calculation. The salary requested is the percent effort of the salary. So that's this calculation. And then the benefits is the fringe benefit rates times the amount of salary. And so then here's your sum, and it just adds it up. In this particular example, I need to buy a piece of equipment, an analyzer, $7,500. Note that it's greater than $5,000. And in my prior slide about exempt equipment over $5,000, in my calculation for F&A, this equipment is subtracted out. So then you've got travel, and they typically want you to break down. They're going to want you to justify your travel. Then you don't have to get too in the weeds about this, but how much are you estimating your airfare? How much is your lodging going to cost? How many days are you going to be there? The per diem rate for the university is $75 a day. I'm going to be there for 4 days. I've calculated that up. I'm going to put that in my budget justification, and they'll want to see that. And so then here I have built up what I think my patient care costs are going to be. So here's my quick and dirty little timeline. It's a 3-year project. I want to enroll 50 people. I think I'm going to have 25 folks that don't qualify. So I'm going to have 75 screening visits in my first year. And I am going to enroll 30 people in the first year, and they're going to make it to their first visit. 10 of those are going to make it to their second visit in year 1. I'm going to finish enrolling 20 people in year 2. They're going to have their first visit. I'm going to get 25 people to do their second visit, and then the remainder are going to have their second visit in year 3. So kind of how this breaks down. And I've just kind of built these costs up here. My screening visit is an H&P and a blood draw. I'm going to have 75 of those. Here's just a quick example of how do you get these costs. So if you're going to use a CCTSI resource like the CTRC, you go to our website. If you Google CCTSI, we come up first. You go to the CTRC. We've got a page called pricing. You're looking at the adult GCR or CTRC, and then we've got our entire price list right here. You go through, you find what you want, you pop that price, into your budget. If you're using hospital-related resources, you can always call Lori Blumberg's office, and they'll help you figure out how to get the proper prices for the things that you're doing. So without belaboring the details here, we've got study visit 1, study visit 2, very simply what's going to happen, how much it's going to cost for that activity, how many I'm going to do, builds it up, puts it over here. I'm going to say something about exempt patient care. So I said if it's billed directly from the hospital, it's exempt. And when you get those invoices that come for your clinical research directly from University Hospital, you can pay those in the category in a finance system that's called outpatient expenses or inpatient expenses, and the finance system won't charge F&A to those. If you get a bill from the CTRC, the outpatient CTRC, we're now in the Andrews Health Science Building. We are not a hospital entity, and so our bills are not exempt from F&A. So you got to think about that when you're building up your budget. If you know that your patient care activities are going to be part of the outpatient CTRC, when you calculate your overall F&A, you can't exempt those dollars from your budget, because the university will end up charging you those. So you want to make sure that you get them in the right category, so that when your grant's awarded, you have the correct amount of F&A in your budget, and you won't get penalized for that. So then you've got recruitment related costs that you're talking about, at $25 per visit. I've calculated 115 visits in year 1. That calculates out. And then we've got some stuff that's happening in the core lab. So a really simple budget. The point being, you got to think about this as you kind of build this up. You calculate these values. This value here is just the sum of all of these things. And then I've made my F&A calculation to be 55% of all the direct costs, except for those items that we're saying are exempt from F&A. So that's what this formula is. It's this times it's this minus this times the F&A rate. That's built up my budget for year 1. Similar, just very similar for year 2. I inflated my salaries by 3%. The calculations are the same. I went through the second year of my budget, how many of these things are going to happen at these different screening and visit experiences, build up the dollar amounts, and create my year 2 budget. Year 3 is the same way. Salaries are inflated again, 3% over year 2. And then I always build a little table like this, because ultimately when you're completing your application in the InfoEd system, then you have to, you need to know what these sum amounts are for the entire project and for each year, and be able to validate that your budget that's been put into the system is matching what you have. I've got a draft budget justification, and I'm going to give all of these things to Carly, so she'll have these and be able to distribute them to you. They may be helpful, may not be helpful in any capacity. But a typical budget justification that we do, we list the personnel. You're required to list calendar months. They don't want to see it in FTE, percent of full time. They want to know how many calendar months. And so, principal investigators, it would be, in my example, it would be Ronald Sokol, principal investigator, 2.4 calendar months. Dr. So-and-so is, and what are their qualifications? What will they be doing for this subject? Continue that down. You've got a study coordinator at 6 calendar months. He's a PRA with this much experience, and here's what he's going to be doing. And so that's basically the way that you build up a budget justification for a person on your project. We have your equipment. You're going to say how much it costs. You're going to write in there, why do you need this piece of equipment for this project? And you're going to need to make sure that you attach a quote if you're purchasing equipment and you know in advance. Here's where I talked about the travel. They want to see it spelled out. They don't want to just see $2,000 to attend the endocrine conference. They want to see, $1,475 to attend the endocrine conference, and this is how I got to this dollar amount. And here's some stuff about supplies that I'll just let you guys read at your leisure if you ever pull this out to support your preparation of a budget justification. These are some instructions from actual, from some of the NIH grant instructions. And categories with amounts less than $1,000 don't need to be itemized. So basically what they're getting at is like things like, if you're going to say chemicals, and it's going to be $3,000. It has to be more than just chemicals at $3,000. They want to see a little bit more built up around that. What chemicals are you buying? What does it cost? How much are you anticipating that you need? And they want to kind of see that detail. I actually, on our grant even, which doesn't fund laboratory work, we had in there 1 year supplies for the CTRC, and I got an under just-in-time request from the grant specialist. I got asked for that information. How did you come up with this amount? And we literally had to itemize syringes and needles. I mean, it was a big pain in the ass. It was ridiculous. Some more comments about patient care costs and about other costs. These are things that I copied and pasted right out of some of the instructions. Important just comment about putting in IRB costs. So remember the F&A slide that I showed you. One of the things that funds is funded by F&A is our IRB. So you're not allowed to put in any costs related to work done by our own IRB. And that's also why if you're putting in an IRB that's funded by a federal project, you don't have to pay any IRB costs here. But if you were funding activities at another institution and they had IRB costs, those could go into the budget unless they are putting their own F&A negotiated dollars into that budget, which they should be. And if part of their calculation is their own IRB, they couldn't include that there. It's just a kind of a very nitpicky little rule. So that I'm just going to leave, and it'll be part of materials that you can have if you ever needed to look at them. The last thing I kind of wanted to show you is now your grant is funded, and how do you track it, right? So I create literally something like this is what I do for small grants. I recreate my grant budget. These are the folks that are in the budget pages that we just looked at. These are and this is for year one. Here's the items of cost in the first year budget and what I expected them to be. This is after the grant is funded. If my grant budget got cut anywhere, then I clearly wouldn't want to use these dollars that we built up to fund to prepare the budget for the application, because what got funded is now a different dollar amount. So I would want this budget column here to reflect actually the dollars that were in my notice of grant award. And that may mean that you have to make some determinations up here on these people, and where you had planned to fund them at 20%, 5%, 50%, 5%, you got cut. You might have to cut some of this back. You might only be able to afford a 40% coordinator. Anyways, the point being, whatever decisions you make to get this budget into what's funded, that's what you need. That needs to be your starting point. And then you lay out 12 months. I lay out 12 months and I project these expenses over 12 months. This is highlighted because every year we get a 3% increase on average. I want to make sure I'm accounting for those dollars. So I'm taking this dollar amount here and I'm initially dividing it by 12 and I got 2 months, and now I've increased it by 3%. And I'm drawing that out for the rest of the 12 months. I'm trying to make a prediction of when I'm going to buy my piece of equipment, and I'm putting that projection in there when I think I'm going to buy it. And in this particular example, what I thought was going to be a $7,500 piece of equipment is now really only $7,200. So ultimately, I've saved $300 that I can use someplace else in my grant. I've laid out my little expenses. I'm kind of projecting how I think they're going to go. In this particular example, you can see that months May through November, those have already occurred, and these expenses have already been tallied up. And so I'm calling them actual. They're real. These are what actually happened in these months on this make-believe project. And this shaded area is still projected. These are expenses yet to come. And every time I think about future expenses, I now have new information based upon what has actually happened, what I've already spent money on, what stage of my project I'm already in. I've got that knowledge that can now inform these decisions here. Are these projections still realistic when I made them 12 months ago, or do I need to update them? Do I now know that I'm not going to get this many screening visits in, and so I'm not going to be spending this amount of money for the last 5 months of the project? It's really going to be $200 a month. I would update. I would, in my own projection, I would update that, because ultimately you want this tool here to inform you of where you, with your best guesses of what's already happened, what you've already had to pay, what you think you're going to pay. How much money are you going to have left over when you get to the end of your project? Sometimes most of the grants that you guys would be associated with in early stages of your career, you're allowed to carry money from one year to the next. My grant, the CTSA grants, I can't carry what's left in year 1 to year 2 and year 2 to year 3. So for me, and you saw that dollar amount, it's $8 million. For me, this is a really critical exercise. I don't get as in the weeds as this in my real life tracking of my projects, but it's so critical for me to know where am I projected to be on April 30th with my balance, because if I'm projected to have $10,000 here, I'm going to lose it. So I want to figure out ways to spend it. And I don't want to be making those decisions in April. I want to be making those decisions here in November and December, looking at my best projections and saying, hey, looks like I'm going to have about $10,000 left. How should we spend it? In a compliant, legal way, but spend it. Don't leave it on the table. I also want to know here, am I looking at $20, $30, $100,000 deficit come April? Because if that's true, then we got to be making decisions about, okay, can we afford to support all of these people at the effort that we're supporting them? Are some of these decisions non-personnel expenses? Is there ways where we can cut back to kind of draw this bottom line projection, closer to the break-even point? That's what this tool is for. An important thought just came to me is that when you get a grant that's a multi-year grant, make sure that you ask the question of your administrative support or even grants and contracts if you can't get an adequate answer. Does your project allow automatic carry forward or not? If it does, then anything that's remaining here, if it has automatic carry forward, would carry to year 2. So now your year 2 budget, which is going to look like a new sheet, something like this, with $150,000 in it, would have whatever was left in the prior year period to add to that. And you can build that into you would definitely want to build that into your expenses for the year, because now you have more money in year 2 than you thought. If you're running some kind of a clinical research project, that's often important because, as you know, we never seem to accrue into trials the way that we think we are. So we've got all of these expenses in the early years that we thought we would spend because of robust accrual, when really that accrual is not happening until year 2 or something like that. So having those funds carry over to the next year is very important. The flip side of that is, if you get the answer that no, your project does not allow automatic carry forward, you want to bring this projection as close to zero as possible. So that's all I'm going to say about any of that. I mean, this is very in the weeds and detailed, depending upon what department, division, section you reside in. Some departments have great grants level support for their investigators. Some operating units don't have any. So depending upon what's available for your particular academic unit, somebody might be doing this for you. Somebody might be providing certain reports that you would use that information then to transfer onto here to say, hey, I paid this guy myself $2,300 in May. I paid this guy this much money. I had incurred these kinds of expenses here. There might be reports that they're providing that to you, and this is your responsibility to do, or they may have some kind of a similar type of a tracking application where they'll set up your project in their system and load all these expenses in it for you. At some point, though, you want to be meeting regularly with them, quarterly at least, so that you get an idea of where are you in the life of your budget, because you don't want to wait until the last couple weeks of each year to figure out what to do. If this is deep into the negative, somebody has to cover that for you if you don't have your own deep pockets. If it's deep onto the positive side, then you're potentially losing the opportunity to spend money that's intended to support your research program. So I'm going to stop there. There's a couple of minutes left. If anybody has any particular questions, I'd be happy to try to respond to those.
Thanks, Tim. I appreciate the detail on this, as I think it really helps as an early career researcher. Where I seem to struggle with budgeting is thinking about it's easy to budget for a small grant or even a K grant, because all of that is focused on my salary, admin, staff support salary. Where I struggle is when you start to get into the bigger NIH grants, the R01s, R03s, things like that. And then you also have to budget for your key personnel who might be more associate professor at professor level. And I struggle on what seems to be in a reasonable amount for their expertise and mentorship on this, when they may not actually provide, actual work on the project. Does that make sense?
Yeah, totally. And there, I would have recommend that if you have a mentor that you work with, those are perfect questions for that, because these on our campus especially, we have very expensive people, right? And it can eat up a budget really quickly for dollars that you could really use to support the actual in the trenches work for your project, right? But you need to be fair to compensate the experts that you're bringing in as well for their advice. And so I would start first with my mentor, and then also my colleagues to say, hey, what have you done? Because everybody struggles with the same thing. And you're right. I mean, if you're paying for a little bit of expertise, but not a lot of hands-on, then maybe you want to be looking at 3% or 5%, and that person's bio sketches in your grant and speaks for itself in terms of the expertise that they're bringing. And you've put that in your budget justification for what this person is going to be doing. They're an expert in ABC, and this is what they'll be providing. But to get to that appropriate amount of FTE support, you almost have to just ask around and say, hey, what do people feel is the best of me?
Right. Okay. Thank you. I appreciate that. Or like someone who's or even a biostatistician, where they are going to do the work.
Yeah.
And they do eat up a good portion of your budget. So that's the tricky part I find sometimes too.
Yeah. And they're expensive also. Fortunately that our CETA group here, they've got a lot of experience now also in understanding how much effort they think is reasonable to ask for you to put their folks on your budget once it's funded to get that work done. Another comment that I would make, that I didn't talk about, is that you also need to budget for cost increases in some of those, like the CTRC costs. We always tell people to budget 6%. Often we don't increase our prices that much. This year we had to, because we moved to entirely new unit. We have a new cost structure, but it's important to get those things in there so that they're properly reflected in your budget, so that you have the opportunity to get the maximum amount of funding that you can. And then if we don't end up having those cost increases, you've already built them in your budget, and you can use those to kind of, spread out some of the areas where you didn't, where you kind of cost overrun a little bit.
Okay. That's helpful. Thank you.
Sure. All right, well, we made it